Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to the virtual U.S. Philatelic Classic Society Annual Meeting. We have two presentations today. Starting immediately after my comments, Scott Steward will talk about U.S. domestically mailed circulars to 1900. And then at 2 o'clock, Mike Platt will talk about the Great Sanitary Fair in Philadelphia. Just a few comments. These programs are being recorded as webinars, so the panelists cannot see or hear you. You can ask questions of the panelists using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. And also we have closed captions turned on for this meeting. You can turn off the closed captions, look for the CC button. And depending on which version of Zoom you're using, it may be at the bottom of the screen. On an iPad, it might be at the top right, and you might have to click the three dots to get more options to find the closed caption control. So our first presentation is Scott Steward, U.S. domestically mailed circulars to 1900. Scott first became interested in stamp collecting as a young boy in the 1970s when his father tried it as a hobby. His father lost interest after a few years, but Scott was hooked. In the mid-2000s, Scott made the switch to collecting postal history. His primary collecting interests today are the postal history of Western North Carolina and printed matter. Scott is a member of numerous philatelic organizations, including the U.S. Philatelic Classic Society, North Carolina Postal History Society, and the Civil War Philatelic Society. Scott has written a number of articles which can be found in the North Carolina Postal Historian. Scott is an active participant in the Baltimore, Washington chapter of the Classic Society. Scott currently serves as a member of the board of directors and as webmaster for the North Carolina Postal History Society. Professionally, Scott is a materials scientist and chemist. He currently works as the Deputy Chief Technology Officer at the Naval Surface Warfare Center headquarters in Washington, D.C. Please join us in welcoming Scott.
Share my screen at this point?
Yes.
All right. So, okay, let me shift my. All right. Thank you very much. As David mentioned, the topic of my presentation is domestically mailed circulars to 1900. So I'd like to start with just a brief outline of the presentation. I'll have a kind of a short introduction. Then we'll look at pre-1845 circulars. Then we'll kind of step through each of the rate changes from 1845 through 1900. And then I'll have a few words about going forward of what happened to the circular as a type of mail after 1900. All right, so for purposes of the presentation, I'm defining a circular as a letter which copies are sent to many recipients to communicate the same piece of information. And also I'm limiting what I'm including here to circulars to be items that are in a letter form factor. And that's just to differentiate them from other types of printed matter, you know, magazines, newspapers, and the like. So originally circulars were used to issue a command or provide general information to a group. But in the 18th and 19th century, they became adopted for commercial purposes. And then in the postal reform movements of the 1830s and 1840s, you know, there was a general desire to try to increase general communication and increase commerce. And as part of this, reduced rates were put in place for circulars starting in 1845. But prior to the implementation of the 1845 rates, circulars were sent either at a letter rate or a printed sheet rate. And so we'll start off by looking at a few examples from this time period. So the Ordinance of 1782 only defined two types of mail. There was the letter rate and there was an unspecified newspaper rate available. So here's an example of a circular. This was mailed August 5th, 1784. It was mailed from New York to Westerfield, Connecticut, but the circular itself originated in Amsterdam. but it wasn't mailed until it made it to New York. So presumably someone carried it over in the ship and then took it to the post office in New York and mailed it. And all of the early circulars I've been able to find, and earliest one I found so far is from 1783. And so all of these early circulars seem to originate somewhere outside the country. They were carried into the country and then mailed. And so I have yet to be able to find any circulars that were printed, early circulars that were printed here in the country after the Revolution. And so this was mailed at the letter rate. And so you can see it was rated up here in the top right corner at the 2 penny weight, 16 grain, which was for a single sheet going 101 to 200 miles. Okay, here's a second example. Now, in 1794, they created another mail rate. This was for the magazine and pamphlet rate. And so down at the bottom, you can see a table showing the magazine and pamphlet rate. So this one, and this was, a little bit of a quandary here, right? Because this was mailed in August of 1820, mailed from Saco, Maine to Corinth, Maine. And so it wasn't mailed at the letter rate like you might expect based on the last example. You can see up here on the right, it was mailed at 2 cents. And over on the left, it's marked what seems to be commercial paper, 2 sheets. And so that, I believe they've pulled that 2 cent rate was from the less than 50 miles for 1 cent per sheet. Fortunately, the actual distance, if you look from Saco, Maine to Corinth, Maine, is more than 50 miles. Probably should have fallen into that 1.5 cent rate, but they didn't. They rated it at the 2 cents. All right. So in 1832, we get some new guidance in effect. So May 1st, 1832, Post Office Laws and Regulations, Section 34 says that letter postage is to be charged on all handbills, printed or written, proposals for new publications, circulars, written or printed, and it goes on to list a few other items. And so after this time, we actually have direction that says circulars are supposed to be mailed at the letter rate. Now, there are still, even after this law went into place, there are known examples of circulars that were not adhering to this law, although they seem to be fairly rare. And those are typically mailed at the periodical magazine and pamphlet rate. All right, so here's an example at the letter rate. This is from August of 1844, mailed from Norwich, Connecticut to Middletown, Connecticut. And it's rated up here on the right at 10 cents postage, which is the single sheet rate for 30 to 80 miles. All right, here's another example from May of 1845. This was mailed from Gardner, Maine to Sedgwick, Maine, and it was rated at 12.5 cents postage, the letter rate for a single sheet going 80 to 150 miles. All right, now here's a little bit more interesting example. And so this is from 1844. It was mailed from Concord, New Hampshire to Newport, New Hampshire. As you can see, it was rated here in the upper right at 1.5 cents postage. So it wasn't mailed at the letter rate as you might expect. It was mailed at the periodic magazine and pamphlet rate for up to 100 miles. And so what's interesting is this contains a proclamation from the governor of New Hampshire declaring the upcoming 14 November as a day of Thanksgiving. So if you dig into the postal laws and regulations a little bit at this time, you can find that the 1843 PL&R section 177 says that periodical pamphlet postage will be charged on publications of either the House of a state legislature, which includes reports of committees and executive messages. And so since this was a proclamation from the governor, this seems to have been counted as an executive message and was allowed to be mailed at the lower periodic magazine and pamphlet rate. And a lot of the circulars I've found that have this 1.5 cent rate, they seem to fall into this exception for legislatures or other state government officials. All right, so let's move on. As I mentioned, we have a new rate come into effect on July 1st, 1845, so reducing finally the rates for circulars from the letter rate. And so this new rate was for circulars, handbills, and advertisements. And in order to qualify for the new circular rate, it had to be printed on paper that was at most single cap in size. And that's about 18 by 8 by 13 inches. Anything that was larger than this was considered a pamphlet. So down at the bottom, you can see the rate table showing you the circular rate. And as I go through this presentation, you'll see for each new rate period, I have a rate table similar to this where I'll show you the circular rate and I'll show you some other relevant rates just for comparison. So you can see, you know, the discount that you got as mailing at the circular rate. So you can see the circular rate was at 2 cents per sheet compared with the pamphlet rate at 2.5 cents per copy. All right. Also, there were a couple other requirements to qualify for the circular rate. First, it must be entirely printed or lithographed, can contain no handwriting. There was one exception made for signature verification. And so by that, I mean, if you were starting a business and you were going to be sending out correspondence to your customers, you could send out a circular that says, hey, this is what my signature looks like, so that when you get correspondence from me, you know it's really from me. Also, any circulars that were sent had to be unsealed. That was so the postmaster could inspect them to make sure they didn't require any didn't have any handwriting. And then there were some other requirements at various times, and we'll talk about those as we move through the presentations. All right, now here's a not very, nice looking example of a circular from this time period. It's got a fairly unclear circular date stamp from Albany, New York. But what makes this really fairly special is it was mailed on July 1st, 1845. So this is a first day usage of the new circular rate that went into effect on that day. So as you can see up the right, we're rated at the 2 cent per sheet rate. And down at the bottom, we've got a small black hand stamp identifying this as a printed circular. All right, here's a little bit nicer looking example from December of 1845. It was mailed from Indianapolis, Indiana to Switzerland County, Indiana, and we're paying the 2 cents postage. And so over here on the right, you can see now we've got the 2 cent postage, but now we've got a red paid. So the previous example was sent unpaid. And it's fairly unusual, for circulars to be sent unpaid, just because, the vast majority you're trying to, interest somebody in buying your goods. And so it's, considered bad form to make the potential customer have to pay the postage to get your circular. So, most of the ones you run across are going to be paid in advance, but there are a few examples of ones that I'll show that aren't paid. All right, so here's another example. This is from December of 1846, mailed from Washington, D.C. to Ridgefield, Connecticut. And so this one is rated at 4 cents because this was a double rate circular. So unfortunately, the second sheet has been lost, but if you'll read the circular, you can see it refers to the enclosed form. And so I presumably that form was taken and used and, filled out and returned. But either way, this, is an example of a double rate circular from this time period. All right, now here's a little bit more interesting example from March of 1846. This was mailed from Troy, New York to Quakertown, New Jersey. You can see in the upper right, it was originally rated with a hand stamp at the 5 cent letter rate, but then that was corrected in manuscript to the 2 cent circular rate. Now here's an example going the other direction. This is from September of 1845, mailed from Palatine Bridge, New York to Albany, New York. It was originally rated at the 2 cent rate, but then that got scratched out and they corrected it to the 5 cent letter rate because this was a form that somebody had filled out and was trying to return it. So there was handwriting in it. All right, so we have a new rate going into effect on March 3rd, 1847. And so what's kind of interesting about the implementation of this rate is it kind of sets up an odd situation, right? Because typically when the Congress would pass new postage rates, they would pass those in kind of that February, March timeframe, and they'd go into effect later, a few months later in that kind of May, June kind of time frame. So you had some time for word of the rate increase to matriculate out, and also that all the post offices knew that the new rate was coming into effect, and they were ready to rate letters at those new rates on that day. Well, for whatever reason, Congress did not put in a delay in implementation before they put it for this rate. So it went into effect on the day that Congress passed it on March 3rd, 1847. And so that caused a few issues, and we'll see an example of that. Also, they put in a new provision that all postage on circulars must now be paid by the sender. So they're saying no more collect circulars. And so down here, you can see the rate for a circular at 3 cents per sheet. Okay, now here's an example. This is from originally mailed on March 22nd from New York to Jefferson, New York. And so you can see it was rated at 2 cents. And so this was 19 days after the new rate went into effect. And so apparently either the clerk who originally rated it didn't realize that the new rate was coming into effect, or somebody, somebody informed him that, hey, no, there's a new rate now, because this cover got re-rated on the next day on March 23rd, now at the new 3 cents per sheet rate. All right, you recall how I mentioned there was an exception made for handwriting if it was a signature verification. And so this is an example of one of those. So on the bottom, you can see the signature verifications. So this, the circular itself inside is dated October 1st, 1849 in New Orleans, but it was mailed from Henderson, Kentucky on October 23rd to Lancaster, Ohio. So up at the top, we're rated at this at the 3 cent per sheet rate. And as I mentioned, it contains signature verifications. And so it's kind of a little bit of an interesting story that, two of the partners lived in and worked in New Orleans, and two of the partners lived and worked in Henderson, Kentucky. And so what seems to have happened is they printed the circular in New Orleans. The two partners in New Orleans applied their signatures. Then they packaged all the circulars up, shipped them to Henderson, Kentucky, where the Henderson, Kentucky partners put on their signatures. And then they mail the circular from Henderson, Kentucky. And that's why you've got such a fairly long time gap between the date on the circular and then the date of mailing. All right, now here's another example from New York, 1849, mailed from New York to Maine. And so now this one is rated at 6 cents. So this is another example of a double rate circular. And not unlike the other one, the second sheet for this has been lost, although when you read through it, it does refer to, their pig iron prices, which would have been on the other sheet. All right, so again, a new rate comes into effect on July 1st, 1851, and this is a distance-based rate. And so, we're moving into the 1850s, and this is by far the most fascinating time period rate-wise for circulars. We'll see some, fairly interesting things. Also, now we've got a provision that allows unpaid circulars, but they're charged at a double rate. And then finally, they have combined the pamphlets with circulars. So now they are at the same rate. And also of note, this is the shortest rate period for circulars, lasting only 15 months. Okay, so here's our rate table. As you can see, we've got 5 different levels of rates, depending upon the distance, going from 1 cent up to 5 cents. And it's kind of interesting that, there are no known examples of the 3 and the 4 cent circular rate. And the reason I believe that is because if you're mailing a circular and it weighs a half an ounce or less, and vast majority of them do, and if it's traveling that 1,500 to 3,000 mile distance, there's really no reduction in postage from the letter rate. So that would be at 3 or 4 cents. And if you compare that with a paid letter rate, which was at 3 cents. So there's really no advantage if you're mailing something at those distances. All right, so let's look at a few examples. Here's an example from March of 1852, mailed from Troy, New York to Adams, New York. And it's rated at the 1 cent postage for the less than 500 miles. Okay, here's another example from December of 1851, mailed from New York to Aiken, South Carolina, rated at 2 cents postage for that 500 miles to 1,500 mile distance. Okay, here's a third example. This is from July of 1852. It was mailed from San Francisco, California to Boston, Massachusetts. And so this was at the top of the rate table. This is at 5 cents for greater than 3,500 miles. And so this would have been mailed from San Francisco, where in this case, it was put on the steamship Columbia, where it was carried down to Panama, carried across the Isthmus of Panama, where it was put on the steamship Ohio for its trip to New York. And then it finally made its way up to Boston to be delivered to the recipient. All right, now here's a fairly unusual example. This was from July of 1851. It was originally mailed from Albany, New York to Lowell, Massachusetts. So if you look up the top, we've got this 1 cent postage paid for our less than 500 mile rate. Gets to Lowell, Massachusetts, and I guess our recipient, Dr. Curtis, has moved on to Boston. And so at the time, there was no way to forward mail in this class of mail in the postal system. But what happened is the postmaster there in Lowell forwarded it on, but you can see he forwarded it on at a 5 cent rate, which was the fee or the charge for postage for a not prepaid letter rate. So this got forwarded on as an unpaid letter rather than at the circular rate. All right. So finally, on October 1st of 1852, we have a greatly simplified rate structure come into effect. Also in this new time period, any unpaid circulars are charged double. But that unpaid provision was eliminated in 1857, and they required payment in stamps on your circulars. Also, in 1857, there was a new requirement went into effect that says a business card on an unsealed envelope of a circular subjects the entire packet to letter postage. And so what they're really talking about there is what we call a corner card. So if you've got that corner card after 1857, if you've got a corner card on your envelope, it subjected the whole thing to letter postage. Now, previously to this, they treated corner cards and similar types of labels that might be advertising as an additional circular. And so we'll look at some examples of that. Also, during this time, forwarding is still not officially available. And also of note, during this time, postal stationery envelopes become available at the circular rate. All right. So here's our rate table. You can see for a circular, got our 1 cent, and that's 1 cent per circular, right? So even though it's got a 3 ounce limit, if I had an envelope with two 1 ounce circulars in them, which only, of course, add up to 2 ounces, I would have to pay 1 cent for each of those. Whereas if I had one circular that weighed 2.5 ounces, I would only have to pay 1 cent. And then down here's the rates for the not prepaid circulars. And of course, those are double from the prepaid. All right. So here's an example of a mourning circular, and that's fairly unusual type of item to find a mourning item mailed at the circular rate. And so this was mailed in April of 1858 from Middletown, Connecticut to Philadelphia, PA, paying the 1 cent postage with this nice, 1857 stamp. All right. Now here's an example from August of 1856. And so mailed from Cincinnati, Ohio to Delaware County, Indiana. And so as you can see on the right, we got a pair of 1851s paying a double rate postage. And so that's because we're paying 1 cent for mailing the circular that this contains. And then we're paying another cent to pay for this advertising label for T.F. Randolph and Brothers. All right, now here's this item. The date's a little unclear, but it does seem to fall into this time period. It was mailed to Burlington, Vermont. And so you can see up at the top, it's notated as 3 printed circulars. And so we're paying the 3 cent rate because this is paying 3 cents because this is a triple rate item since we've got our 3 circulars in the envelope. All right, now here's another example of an envelope with a label from May of 1857. And so this time our label just says circular paid, and this is what's commonly known as the Lockport label. And so this item was mailed from Lockport, New York to Bethlehem, PA. And because this label is not advertising the business, it's really only designated the item as a circular and that postage was paid on it. It doesn't count. So this gets to go at the 1 cent rate. All right, now here's a little bit more kind of an odd item, right? Recall how I mentioned that, after 1857, you had the requirement that if you had a corner card or if you had a business card or any kind of writing on the outside of your envelope, it was gonna go at the letter rate. And so this is from November of 1859, and it was mailed from Philadelphia, PA to Granite Hill, North Carolina. It's mailed, got this 1857 here, paying our 1 cent circular rate. And so what seems to have happened here is the mailer, there's some fairly large printing across the front of this. And so the mailer has put a piece of tape over this so that it's obscured so that he could mail this at the circular rate rather than having to pay the letter rate. So if you hold this up to the light, underneath it says, Sir John Franklin at last discovered. Read this carefully. And so this is an advertisement for a book about Sir John Franklin. And if you're not familiar with him, he was a Arctic explorer who he left England in 1845 to go help map the Canadian Arctic. He had his expedition had 129 people in the expedition, and they were never seen again. And there were numerous rescue attempts sent to try to, rescue him or find out what happened to the expedition. And actually, finally in 1850, the English government put on a reward out for anybody that could, bring them back alive. If you could do that, you got 20,000 pounds. And if you could find out what happened to them, they would pay you 10,000 pounds, which was quite a bit of money in 1850. And so finally in early 1859, somebody who was out trying to find out what happened to the Franklin expedition actually found some notes that had been left by the Franklin expedition, kind of detailing when people died and where they were going to and what was going to happen and what had happened to them. And so it was fairly big news at the time. And so this was just somebody who was selling a book describing, this new find and really more information on the Franklin expedition. All right. So a lot of people find that previous example kind of odd. So I always like to show a second example, right? So this is from July of 1859. It's mailed from Concord, New Hampshire to Pittsfield, New Hampshire. And so Up in the corner, we've got a circular corner card for a fire insurance company. And so what seems to have happened here is, again, to avoid paying that letter rate and to be able to mail it at the circular rate, the sender has put the stamp over top of the corner card and then to obscure it. And then when the postmaster applied his circular date stamp, he applied it over top of the corner card so that it was obscured even further, and then they let it pass at the circular rate rather than being charged the letter rate. All right, and as I mentioned, at this time, the pre-printed stationery becomes available. So here's a from November of 1861, a 1 cent entire mailed from Boston, Massachusetts to West Pollitt, Vermont, which contained a circular. All right, you may recall I mentioned that there was still the provision to mail an unpaid circular. So this is an example of an unpaid circular from March of 1856. It was mailed from Boston, Massachusetts to Manchester, New Hampshire. You see it was rated at the 2 cent rate because it was unpaid. And so the recipient of this in Manchester, New Hampshire, had to pay the 2 cents to get this circular. And bad news for him, it was just a note from his bank telling him that his loan was due. So not only did he have to pay the loan, he had to suffer the indignity of paying the 2 cents for the note reminding him it was due. All right, so here's an example from March of 1862, a little bit more, a little interesting example. Originally mailed from Danvers, Massachusetts to Boxford, Massachusetts at the 1 cent rate. Well, once it got to Boxford, Massachusetts, our intended recipient, Mr. Peabody, seems to have moved on to East Longmeadow, Massachusetts. And so what appears to have happened is someone there in Boxford applied a second 1861 1 cent stamp so that it could then be forwarded on to Mr. Peabody in East Longmeadow. Even though at this time, there was no provision for forwarding this type of mail, it seems like it was, had the second 1 cent stamp applied so it could be remailed and forwarded on. All right. So our next rate period started on July 1st, 1863. And this is when we finally start to divide mail into classes. So we had 3 classes. We had the first class, which was the letter rate, had the second class, which had printed matter issued at a regular interval. So this was newspapers, magazines, things like that. And we had a third class, which was all other mailable matter. But circulars are grouped as third class, but they have their own separate rate within the third class tier. And so as you can see here, the third class rate was 2 cents for up to 4 ounces, but circulars were 2 cents for up to 3 circulars to the same address. So now if you've got that corner card, it's not a problem, right? Because even if that's counted as another circular, you can have 3 circulars in your envelope. All right, now here's a really nice example. This is one of my favorite items just because I think it's so pretty with the pair of 1861s and the really nice bullseye. But this was from June of 1865, mailed from Oxford, Massachusetts to Swansea, Mass. And again, we're paying that 2 cents for up to 3 circulars with that pair of 1861s. All right, here's another example from 1866 from Cincinnati, Ohio to Xenia, Ohio. We're paying 2 cents postage with the blackjack, and we got that nice circular grilled killer on that. Okay, here's a little bit more interesting example, right? And so the year on this is a little unclear, but it does seem to fall within this rate period. And so this item was mailed from Boston, Massachusetts to Winchester, New Hampshire. And again, we're paying that 2 cent circular rate with the 2 cent blackjack. But there's a notation over here on the left. The postmaster seems to have found that the circular contained writing. And so it reads, circular partially writing due 1 cent. So he's assessed this item with an additional 1 cent postage to bring it up to the letter rate. And also what's interesting is it seems like that the intended recipient here at the Winchester National Bank, at least initially, seems to have refused to pay that additional 1 cent to be able to receive this item. All right, here's another kind of an interesting thing, right? And so it's not to look at the front. It's not particularly, eye appealing or anything. Dates unclear on this. Mailed from New York to Palmyra, New York, and we're paying that 2 cent rate with an 1869 stamp. But what makes this interesting is on the back we've got a black hand stamp, and it says J. Arthurs Murphy, Mercantile Agency, 111 Nassau Street, New York. Circulars addressed and distributed all over the U.S. So it seems that Mr. Murphy was an early mass mailer. And so I've tried to do some additional research on him, and I've been able to find 3 items that, were somehow associated with him so far. Three postal items, and they're all associated with an 1869 stamp. So that's interesting. There's 2 of them I found with the this black hand stamp on the back, and then there's one I've seen that has a corner card for his business. And also I've been able to find some magazine, professional trade journal type advertisements where he's advertising his services to, either address circulars and mail them out for you, or he also sells mailing lists. So if you want to address your own circulars, you can, send off to him, buy your mailing list, and, mail those off yourself. Now, also just of note, another company that many of you are probably familiar with, a local post, Boyd's, after they kind of stopped doing the local delivery so much, they actually shifted into a business model similar to this, and they continued to stay in business into the 20th century, mailing circulars and selling mailing lists to businesses that might want to mail out circulars. All right. Also, of course, during this time, we had the Civil War going on. And so here's an example of a Confederate circular from March of 1864. And it's paying the Confederate rate of 2 cents per ounce and that covered circulars and some other printed matter type items. This was mailed from Richmond, Virginia to Marion, Virginia. And of course, we're paying that 2 cent postage with the stamp. All right. So now we're moving into the 1870s. And so new rates went into effect on June 8th, 1872. Unfortunately, the rating gets a little bit less interesting in the 1870s, not as much to talk about, but we'll make it through those. Also, during this time, circulars now move, from the rate for number of circulars, where you paid your 2 cents for up to 3 circulars. Now we're moving to a weight-based rate like the other third-class matter. And also, there's a special rate established for circulars dropped at a letter carrier office for local delivery. Also, the March 1873 U.S. Mail and Post Office Assistant states, postal laws do not authorize the forwarding from the office of delivery of books and other printed matter on which less than letter rates have been fully paid. So now we finally start to get some guidance on the forwarding of circulars. And so this tells us that, hey, it should be forwarded at the letter rate. But we get some more guidance coming out in 1872. And now they're saying that circulars can be printed matter, and circulars and other printed matter can be forwarded if prepaid at the forwarding office. So this is kind of similar to some of the examples that we've seen earlier. All right, so here's our rate table. You can see Down here, we've got our third class, which includes circulars at 1 cent per 2 ounce. And then we've also got an additional group of third class items, which were books and a variety of other things that were mailed at 2 cents per 2 ounces. All right, so here's an example from August of 1873. It was mailed from New York to Shock, Ohio. And of course, we're paying that 1 cent postage rate, and got the nice cancel there of the star inside the circle. Okay, so new rates go into effect March 3rd, 1875. Now again, circulars have a special rate. And so we've got third class circulars down here going in at 1 cent per ounce. Rest of the third class items going at 1 cent per 2 ounce. All right, so here's an example from this time. This is from November of 1875, mailed from Chicago, Illinois to West Yorkshire, New York, paying the 1 cent postage. Again, we've got that nice cancel there with the blue star in the circle, and we've got our corner card over here for the Excelsior carpet stretcher, which of course at this time doesn't cost any additional fee to be able to send that. All right, so our next rate period goes into effect on May 1st, 1879. And so when they put in place this new rate, they also changed the definition of a circular. So they've changed it now to a printed letter, which according to internal evidence is being sent in identical terms to several persons. And also during this rate period, circulars become completely absorbed into the third class category, and never again to kind of be set off on their own, rates going forward. And then also the 1879 PL&R indicated that non-first class items may be forwarded without additional charge. So now, that would let you forward that circular for free. That rule gets changed in 1887. So now they changed that to say third class matter can be forwarded with postage due at the same third class rate. So now, I could forward it on, can't forward it free anymore, but the recipient has to pay that third class postage when they get it. All right, so here's our rate table. Here's our third class rate at 1 cent per 2 ounces. Here's an example from August of 1898, going from San Francisco, California to Downeyville, California. And we're paying the 1 cent postage with this nice stamp over here on the right. Now here's an example of a forwarded circular. This is from May of 1887, going from New York to Ashtabula, Ohio. And we paid that 1 cent postage. And once it got to Ashtabula, Ohio, needed to be forwarded on to Andover, Ohio. And so it was assessed 1 cent postage due. All right, so going forward, just a few words about what happens to circulars as a type of mail after 1900, right? So finally in 1925, the third class rate increases to 1.5 cents per 2 ounces. But in 1928, bulk rate mail becomes available. And what happens at that time is almost, the vast majority of circulars then shift from third class to this new bulk rate grouping. And so, after 1928, there just aren't that many circulars that were sent at the third class rate anymore. There's a few. If you were mailing, single piece, small numbers of pieces, you would still use the third class rate. But if you were mailing out larger numbers, you would go to the bulk rate, which was cheaper yet. All right. Before I wrap up, I just want to thank the U.S. Philatelics Classic Society for the chance to be able to give this presentation. And also, I'd like to thank Ron Sapola. He's been a tremendous resource for me over the years in trying to understand this type of mail. And he's been a great person to talk to about, figuring out the different rates and understanding some of the examples. So at this point, I will look for any questions.
Well, thank you, Scott. That was a great presentation. You gave an earlier version of that to our local Baltimore Washington club, and I have to say I keep the handout from that handy for the concise summary of the rates. It's a lot quicker than trying to pull my copy of Ashbrook off the shelf or whatever. There's two questions that came in during the talk. One from Jim Milgram. He says, you didn't show the contents for the pre-1845 letters. And he asks whether these were printed letters with no manuscript additions.
Right. So the first one I showed was I believe it had a signature in it, perhaps, but it was almost entirely printed, and it's got a price list in it showing for their goods, and then it's got a little printed letter at the end of it, which actually is fairly interesting because they're saying that their guy is coming to the U.S. and he's going to be going around taking orders, and oh, by the way, he's going to be collecting any overdue bills, any outstanding balances that might have been from before the war or anything like that that might still be owing. And then the second example I showed that was at the 2 cent. That I don't have the contents for that, so I don't know what was inside that one. And then the third pre-1845 was the letter from the contained the proclamation from the governor of New Hampshire, and that actually was all entirely printed.
Okay. Next question here. Someone writes that they have a circular with a pair of number 7s, postmarked New Orleans, May of 1856, that was sent to Liverpool, England. And it has a large black 2 indicating the UK postage due of 2 pence.
Mm-hmm.
The 1848 convention was applied with circulars arriving in the UK from the US requiring 2 pence postage due. Are these transatlantic circulars uncommon?
They're not particularly uncommon, and I will say I'm not an expert by any means in the transatlantic circulars, but I mean I do have some examples of transatlantic circulars in my collection. I mean they're not overly hard to find, I don't think. So.
Okay. Following that, there's a question from John Valenti. He says that in his study, the volume of circulars exploded with the drop of the 1872 rate from 2 cents to 1 cent. Does that correspond with what you found?
So I haven't, particularly looked at the numbers, but it wasn't just circulars. I think that there was one of my other areas of interest is early machine cancels, and I did look at the volume of just general printed matter, and yeah, it was as you start moving into the 1870s, the volume of printed matter goes up dramatically. A lot of that has to do, I think, with the creation of companies like Montgomery Ward and Sears and places like that are selling a lot more items through the mail. But yeah, the general volume of third class items really starts to go up in that time period.
Okay, we have a comment from Gordon Eubanks. He says that the 3 printed circular cover is awesome, but that the Randolph and Brothers cover is in the wrong collection. He wants to know if there's a way to get a copy of your presentation.
Oh, absolutely. Anybody who wants a copy of the presentation, just, I'm in the directory in the Classic Society. Just drop me an email and I'm happy to provide it. And if there's a particular item you want more details on, I'll be happy to send you scans of those.
And I think that is it for the questions that have,
Nope.
Mark Rogers has some plating information for your
Okay.
Middletown, Connecticut morning cover. It's a type 5A position, 27L5.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I didn't know that.
Being able to plate something from a screenshot on a Zoom call is pretty amazing.
Well, yeah. Well, he may have seen that one before because it's passed around a few times over the years. So,
Oh, we got a few more questions that have come
okay.
in. Oh, Mark used to
Okay.
own the cover. That's how he knows.
Okay.